I would like to start, of course, by thanking Dr. Jeffrey Behrens for giving me the opportunity to participate in this conference, which has just been incredibly enriching for me. I really appreciated the opportunity to hear the papers this morning, and I also greatly appreciated the chance to read the papers by Robert Carbonneau and Margaret Gieder. As has been true of all the presentations, the research by Robert and Margaret reveals the richness of Franciscan global mission for our understanding faith from distinct perspectives, but I also think for giving a distinct lens on history. And I think that this came out especially strongly in these two papers because they are so global and they so strongly illustrate all of these distinct linkages in contemporary society. While both researchers cover the 20th century, each takes a very different approach. Robert seeks to provide a comprehensive overview of Franciscan mission in one country, China, in the 20th century, while Margaret offers an in-depth understanding of the impact of mission to the global South on Franciscan leadership and in the United States and globally. Together, I think that the papers reveal one aspect of mission that's sometimes overlooked. Mission has always been, I'm sorry, I just lost my. Mission has always been a two-way street, or really, as we're seeing here, much more than a two-way street, in which the proselytizers are as dramatically influenced by their experiences as the proselytized. Moreover, mission has a plethora of unintended consequences, perhaps as a result of missionaries' efforts to follow where the Spirit leads, particularly in social, political, and cultural contexts that are distinct from the ones that they know best from their place of origin. And I think that we've seen this point in many of the papers today. The conflicting interests of the church and state and trying to negotiate those, distinct mission perspectives within the order, efforts to address or sometimes failures to address and understand the languages and beliefs of the proselytized. In the papers of Margaret and Robert, I think we see ramifications in efforts to promote peace and justice, to provide health services, and to relieve the plight of refugees. In other words, Franciscan mission as presented in this 20th century history is framed far differently from that of the colonial period in the Americas, but as I'm going to say in the conclusion, I think there are things that we need to consider when we're looking at the 20th century that come out of colonial mission. The papers also reveal the challenges that face historians seeking to present mission to readers in a way that is historically accurate and sufficiently detailed, but still, quote unquote, tells a story that brings the experience to life. Robert's approach in what is the start of a book-length manuscript has been to provide a wealth of detail, experiences of individual priests combined with accounts of the work of the entire order over the course of more than half a century. Margaret has introduced the breadth of mission with an accounting of the rapid settlement of missionaries in regions, and I'm going to read this because although she showed it in her slides, I think hearing it is just kind of stunning. In the Caribbean, Central America, South America, and Africa. In a remarkably short period of time of 130 years, the Franciscans were in the Bahamas, in the Caribbean, in the Bahamas, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Santa Lucia, St. Thomas, in Africa, Cameroon, Egypt, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ghana, Kenya, Liberia, Madagascar, Malawi, Morocco, Namibia, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and then in South America, in Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela, Central America, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and Mexico. Here I really want to highlight what I see as a true uniqueness of 20th century missionaries in the United States. So few people in the US actually have the experience of living with anyone outside of their own world, right? I mean, all of the studies that show communities show that people are increasingly isolated into communities that are virtually identical to themselves. Same socioeconomic foundation, same educational background, same ethnicities. And so the lessons that I think that missionaries and the Franciscans in particular can bring back to the 20th century from this experience of living in all of these different contexts, sharing with people who have distinct political perspectives is really important, and I hope that it goes beyond the audience that Margaret so nicely delineated in her paper, but I actually think there's a larger potential audience as well. Margaret has elected to emphasize, in part, the particular experience of missionaries who took leadership positions in their orders. I'm I'm sorry. Particularly as the Sister O'Farrell, Patrick O'Malley, Michael Perry, for example. These missionaries became innovators in leadership for mission, which addresses the question she introduces at the beginning of her chapter, who's going to read this book, aiming at Catholic and an often Franciscan audience. Implicit is the question of what lessons can we learn as Catholics, as Franciscans, etc. Indirectly asking what did these leaders learn from their experiences in mission that allowed them to play such crucial roles subsequently. And she highlighted that a bit more in her presentation. My comments are really limited to asking a few questions and offering what I see as some of the central themes, issues that emerge from these two very detailed papers. As a reader with a somewhat limited familiarity with the Franciscan orders, I have to say that I got a little bit overwhelmed at times, and I'm sure everything is obvious to those with a background in the order, but I got a little bit overwhelmed at times with trying to determine which provinces people were coming from, what the relationship is among the women religious and the men, what drew people to different areas. I don't know if it's possible to articulate that more clearly in the papers at some point, but I think it would be very helpful, perhaps even for people within the order who are coming up later, or people in the global mission who might be reading this who don't have the context of the United States. In Robert's paper, it seemed to me that a number of distinct themes are intertwined in the paper and might be better developed if they were clearly identified and became focal points of individual sections or chapters, even as he maintains this very strong and important chronological focus over the course of half a century. These include the transition from early mission with individual U.S. clergy going to work under European bishops to the sending of the creation of Franciscan missions. And both researchers, in fact, introduce but slightly gloss over this. Margaret provides a little bit more detail, noting, for example, that U.S. Franciscans venturing out into mission beyond borders of the United States were the heirs of an exceedingly complex legacy of European Franciscan missionaries. I think that these are both coming at an important transitional point where the United States starts to become a force in global mission, and trying to articulate that transition from European to U.S. And with, as Margaret pointed out in her paper, there were things that were going on in the United States that also helped to explain that. So I think that would be kind of a helpful thing to perhaps highlight. The question of enculturation, and I was really fascinated by these images that you showed of the early clergy, Father Sylvester Espelaghi, adapting to Chinese clothing, hairstyle, which you just define as an act of devotion. I would love to see more explanation of how that took place and why priests began at such an early stage. I always think of questions of enculturation coming at a much later period, almost post-Vatican II. So kind of what that transformation was in ideas of enculturation and adapting to local cultural norms. The third that comes out that I think is really important is refugee assistance. This was obviously crucial, and as you pointed out in your paper, China can be seen, I think, in many ways as a model for other mission. Refugee assistance in this context seems to be a really important point, particularly because post-World War II, the United States Catholic Church becomes so active in the development of Catholic relief services and the models that come out and the experience in China, but even ministering to Lithuanians, etc., this idea of the Catholic Church and Franciscan missionaries and other missionaries becoming a real force in refugee assistance, which then transitions into other kinds of Catholic assistance that becomes foundational to the way that the United States operates in the world, but also with the way that the Catholic Church operates in the world. And just a note, in 1938, you noted in your paper that in the Wuhan, and forgive me my pronunciation, Wuhan province, the number of refugees increased from 1 million to 1.5 million. So just imagining this increase of 500,000 people over the course of a year, I would love to know more about how the missionaries responded to that. Finally, more generally, the experience of missionaries in war. In both of these contexts, it seems like this is such a crucial element of the missionary experience, and in the context of leadership, bringing that back then. In the context of China particularly, how this plays out in practices of worship, which you talk about in the paper, and I found really fascinating and compelling, and I think is another point that I don't think in what I've read on contemporary mission is not sufficiently developed. And finally, the particular role of women, which you talk about, and the provision of health services. There were some fascinating things in your paper about conflicts also with the private philanthropic individual whose name I can't remember right now, and wanting to provide medical, but also the question of whether or not doctors would be under the auspices of women religious. So these very kind of fascinating things about women religious in this context in Franciscans. So I'm wondering if those things could be talked about a bit more, maybe in the paper or maybe here if you have time to respond. In Margaret's emphasis on mission as a powerful influence on mission leadership, I think is incredibly compelling. Just looking at three of the figures that she focused on, and she did bring this out more clearly, I thought, in the presentation than the paper, but I would love to know a little bit more about what about the particular experience of mission made them better adapted to leadership. And the Vicariate of Solidarity, I think, is one key example of this. But I'm also wondering to what extent this isn't something that's coming out of the experience of the Global South and working with communities that, at least in my study of Latin America, seem to have a much stronger tradition of collaborative organizing than the United States does. And kind of also coming out of these contexts of very desperate situations, right, where there is an immediate need to address situations of poverty, war, all of these things, but also the experience of being able to form organizations that actually manage to do that effectively. So I'm just wondering if either today or at some point you could provide a little bit more detail about what specifically about their experiences made them such strong leaders and continued this very strong commitment to mission. So let's see. My last observation or comment is simply that all of us think more explicitly about the parallels between this morning's papers emphasizing the colonial experiences, sometimes, which I think are sometimes perceived as so dramatically separate, as almost kind of in a secular context, almost like a pre-modern experience in which mission is not threatened by secularization, and the contemporary experience of mission, where I think there is a tendency to assume that separation of church and state, secularization, were such hard, fast rules that the things that influenced mission during the colonial period were not also relevant to the contemporary period. But I think one thing that both of these papers illustrate is that in many ways they were, right? There were still these questions of the relationship between church and state, and to what extent the church would be, and in broader states, right? I mean, to what extent the church was going to be embedded with the United States, to what extent it would deal with states locally. Also questions about the paper this morning on the Vatican and the prelates and the propaganda fide. Where is that in the contemporary period, right? I mean, that clearly is still a central part of it, but we don't see, there's almost, it seems to me in looking at contemporary mission, there's almost a tendency to override that, and I'm not sure why. Also a very different look, I think, between colonial literature, at least for Latin America, which is the literature that I know best. The colonial literature on encounter and religion is, I think, some of the richest in the Latin American historiography, in that it takes very seriously the practices of faith of both the proselytized and the proselytizers. It always feels to me that when we move to the 20th century, that somehow gets lost, and I'm not sure why, but I guess I would, if possible, encourage any of us who are doing 20th century to really try to look at these papers from this morning and this afternoon together and try to think about the kind of points of intersection and the things that we can learn from each other's time periods. And that's it. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and for sharing this amazing work. And I hope if you all want to respond, I would love, I don't know if there's time or how that works, but it would be great. Thank you.